The ladder was the kind that should have been thrown out years ago, aluminum gone soft at the joints, one foot wrapped in duct tape that had baked grey in the sun, and Naomi set it against the side of the church anyway and climbed it the way she had climbed it every July for 6 years. Below her, gravel lot was empty. It was a Tuesday, in the dead heat of the afternoon, the hour nobody came to a church, and that was exactly why she chose it. She did not want to be seen. She did not want anyone to thank her or watch her or ask why a woman who cleaned rooms at the Garden Court Inn for $9 an hour spent her one day off on a roof that was not hers. She wanted the leak fixed before the August storms came. That was all. She had no idea that 200 miles away a man was reading a name on a piece of paper, and that the name was hers, and that everything she had done quietly in the heat was about to be spoken out loud in front of the whole town. Up on the roof, the shingles were curling at the edges where the old flashing had failed, and she ran her palm along the seam the way her father had taught her, feeling for the soft spot, the place where the water got in. She found it near the bell housing, a stretch maybe 4 feet long, where the tar paper had rotted through. She had patched it last summer and the summer before that, and each time it had held one more year, and each time she had promised herself this was the last, that the deacons would find the money, that someone with a real crew and real materials would come. Nobody came. So she came. She knelt on the hot shingles and pried up the failed patch with a flat bar, and the smell of old tar rose up around her, and somewhere below in the empty sanctuary the air conditioner that barely worked hummed against the heat. You should know who Naomi was before you watch what the town learned about her, because the order matters. Most of Cedar Hollow knew her face and almost none of them knew her name. She was the woman at the back of the 11 o'clock service, the one who slipped in after it started and left before the last hymn so she could make her shift. She was the one who left a folded 20 in the offering plate, some weeks and nothing at all. The weeks the rent came due. She had a daughter, Tessa, 9 years old, who drew pictures of houses with too many windows and wanted to be an architect, and the two of them lived in a one-bedroom on Pearl Street where the radiator knocked all winter and the landlord raised the rent every spring like clockwork. Naomi's husband had been gone 4 years, not dead. Just gone, one morning to a job in another state, and then no calls, and then no address, and she had stopped waiting for him around the time Tessa stopped asking. She did not talk about it. She did not talk about much. She worked. She raised her girl, and on her day off, in the summer, she fixed a roof because she knew how, and because it needed fixing, and because nobody else would. Her father had been a roofer. Curtis had run a 2-man crew out of the back of a truck for 30 years, and Naomi had been the second man on that crew from the time she was 12, handing up bundles, learning the slope of things, learning that a roof was a promise, a building made to the people inside it. He died when she was 26, a heart that gave out on a Sunday morning, and she had buried him in the only suit he owned and gone back to work on Monday because there was no other choice. The tools in her bag were his. The flat bar with the worn grip, the hammer with the hickory handle, he had replaced twice, the chalk line in its dented case. When she worked, she could feel him at her shoulder, not as a ghost. She did not believe in that kind of thing, but as a habit of attention, a way of looking at a seam and knowing what it would do in the rain. The church was called Bethel, a plain brick building with a white steeple that the town had stopped, really seeing the way you stop seeing your own front door. It had been there 90 years. Naomi's grandmother had been baptized in it, and her mother and her, and Tessa too, in a white dress that 3 generations of the family had worn. The congregation was small now and getting smaller, old people mostly, a few young families, the collection plate thin. There had been talk for years that the building could not be kept up, that the repairs were more than the people could carry, that maybe the smart thing was to sell the land to the developer, who kept calling and merge with a bigger church out on the highway. Naomi had heard that talk and said nothing, but every summer she climbed the ladder, because as long as the roof held, the talk stayed talk. What she did not know, what nobody in Cedar Hollow knew, was that someone had been watching the building too, not from the parking lot. From a distance, through other people's eyes, the way a careful man watches a thing he is not ready to claim. His name was Walter Banks, and 6 years earlier he had been nothing to anyone in that town, a man who slept in his car 2 streets over when his own life fell apart, and what had happened to him in the shadow of that church was the reason a lawyer in the city now had a folder on his desk with Naomi's name in it. That comes later, though. First, you have to understand how faithful she was, because the reward only means something if you have felt the weight of what it answered. The first summer, she fixed the roof. She did it without asking anyone. She had come to a Wednesday evening service that June and felt the drip on the back of her neck from the water-stained ceiling tile, and she had looked up at the brown bloom spreading across the plaster and known exactly what it was and exactly what it would cost if it was left. So the next Tuesday she came with her father's tools and a bundle of shingles she bought with grocery money, $41 she could not spare, and she fixed it. When the old deacon, Mr. Pruitt, found out, he tried to give her money from the building fund, and she would not take it. There is no building fund worth speaking of, she told him, and you know it. Keep it for the heating bill. He had looked at her for a long moment, this tired woman in work clothes, who had just saved the sanctuary from ruin on her day off, and he had not known what to say. So he had said, "God bless you." And she had said, "The roof should hold a year," and that was the end of it. The second summer, the leak moved. Water is patient that way. It finds the next weak place. And she found it too, over the choir loft this time, and she fixed that. The third summer, it was the flashing around the steeple base, the hardest work 40 feet up on a slope that made her stomach drop, and she tied herself off with a length of rope to the bell housing and did it anyway because Tessa was in the children's choir that year and Naomi would not have water coming down on her daughter's head while she sang. Each summer the building gave her a new problem, and each summer she answered it, and the congregation came to expect it, the way you expect the seasons. The woman on the roof in July, there and gone before most people arrived. Some of them did not even know her name. She was just the roof lady. She was just the one who kept the rain out. Stay with me here, because the thing about a faithful act repeated in private is that it builds a kind of debt the world does not see, and the world has a long memory even when the people in it do not. Naomi was not keeping score. She would have been embarrassed by the very idea. And yet somewhere a ledger was being kept, and it was fuller than she knew. That fourth summer was the hardest year. Tessa got sick in the spring, a fever that climbed and would not break. And Naomi sat up 3 nights running with a cold cloth and a thermometer, and on the 4th night the fever hit a number that made her stop being brave and carry her daughter to the car in a blanket and drive to the emergency room with her hands shaking on the wheel. They kept Tessa overnight. It turned out to be a bad infection that the right medicine put down in a week, and the relief of that should have been the whole story, except that the bill came in an envelope with red letters on it that Naomi kept on top of the refrigerator where her daughter could not reach, and the number on it was more than a month of rent. She picked up every extra shift the hotel would give her. She cleaned rooms until her hands cracked at the knuckles, and she ate the leftovers off the breakfast cart so she would not have to spend on lunch. And she sold the one thing she had left of her marriage, not the ring. She had sold the ring years before in a worse season. This was a thin gold bracelet her husband had given her the first Christmas back when she still believed in him, and she took it to the pawn shop on Main, where a man behind glass turned it over twice and offered her $19, and she said yes before he could change his mind. And she put the $19 toward the hospital bill and did not let herself cry until she was back in the car with the door shut. And still, that July, when the roof needed her, she climbed the ladder. Pruitt found her up there in the heat and stood at the bottom with his hand shading his eyes and said, "Naomi, you cannot keep doing this. You are carrying this whole building on your back and nobody is helping you." She wiped her face with the back of her wrist and looked down at the old man and said, "The roof does not care how my year is going. It just needs to hold." And she turned back to the seam and went on working. There was a boy that summer too, or rather there had been a man, years before, that the town had mostly forgotten. People did not connect him to anything. He had drifted through Cedar Hollow one bad winter, parked his car behind the hardware store, eaten at the soup table, the church ran on Thursdays, and then he was gone in the spring and nobody thought about him again. Naomi remembered him, though a little, because one of those Thursdays the church van had a flat in the gravel lot, and she had been the only one in the building who knew how to break the lugs loose. It was January cold, the kind that gets into the bones of your hands, and the light was already going at 4 in the afternoon, and the man had come out of the basement where the soup table was, and crouched down in the slush and held the work light steady on the wheel, while she fought the spare into place. They had talked the way two tired people talk, about nothing and everything, about the weather and the long roads and the way a hard winter makes a person small. He told her he was nobody, that he used to be somebody, now he was nobody, and she had stopped what she was doing and looked at him over the wheel and said, "That is because you have decided to be, and you can decide different." At the end, when the van was sound again and he was handing her back her father's lug wrench, he had said, "You are the only person in this town who looked at me like I was a person." She had said, "That is because you are one." She had forgotten his face by the next spring. She had not forgotten that. The 5th summer, the developer came back. He came to a deacon's meeting with a number, a real number, more money than anyone in that room had ever seen attached to the dirt under their feet, and he laid out his plan for the land, condominiums and a coffee place, and a parking structure, and he said the building was a liability, that the roof alone would cost $40,000 to replace properly, that they were one bad winter from a collapsed ceiling and a lawsuit. Some of the younger families wavered. The money would fund a beautiful new space in the merged church on the highway, with parking and air conditioning that worked and a youth wing. It was not a foolish argument, it was just a cold one. And at the back of the meeting, Naomi sat with her hands folded in her lap and finally spoke, the only time anyone in that room could remember her speaking at a meeting. She did not stand. She just said, from her chair, that the roof does not cost $40,000 because the roof is not being replaced. It is being kept. I keep it. As long as I can climb a ladder, you will not lose this building to water. The developer had turned to look at her, this woman in a hotel cleaning uniform. She had come to the meeting in straight off her shift, and he smiled the way men smile at something they find quaint, and he said, "Ma'am, with respect, a patch is not a roof, and a volunteer is not a maintenance plan. And one bad winter and one collapsed ceiling and one lawsuit will cost you everything this land is worth." The room held its breath. Naomi looked back at him steadily and said, "Neither is a parking structure a church, and you will not understand the difference because you have never needed one." And the room went very quiet, and old Mr. Pruitt looked at his hands to hide his face, and the vote was tabled, and the building stood 1 more year. I want you to hold on to that moment, because she did not raise her voice and she did not need to, and the developer drove back to the city thinking he had lost a small battle to a stubborn woman, and he had no idea who else had been quietly paying attention to that little brick church, or why. The man who had been watching was Walter Banks, and by that 5th summer he was not sleeping in a car anymore. He was the founder of a company that made surgical equipment, a company that had started in a rented garage the year after he left Cedar Hollow and had grown into something with his name on a building and 400 people on the payroll. The story of how he climbed out of the hole he had been in was the kind of story magazines liked, The Self-Made Man, The Comeback, but the magazines never got the part that mattered to him because he never told them. He never told them about the winter. He had nothing. The winter his marriage had ended and his first business had failed, and he had driven until the car ran out of road and ended up in a town he had never heard of, eating at a church soup table on Thursdays because it was the only hot meal he could count on. He never told them about the night he had decided to stop driving for good, to just stop, and how the only thing that had turned him back from that was a woman in a parking lot who looked at him like he mattered while he held a flashlight on a flat tire. He had carried that town with him for 15 years. And when his company was finally big enough that he could do something quietly, he had hired a man to find out what had happened to that church and to the people in it, and especially to the woman, though all he had remembered of her was that she could fix things and that she had been kind. The report came back thick. The man Walter hired was thorough. He found the church barely holding on, the developer circling, the congregation aging. And he found Naomi, though it took him a while because she had never put her name on any of it. He found 6 years of repairs no one had paid for. He found the pawn ticket from the year her daughter was sick. He found a woman who cleaned hotel rooms for $9 an hour and gave her 1 day off every summer to a roof that was not hers, and who had, the report noted, personally stood between that building and a developer's check more than once. Walter read the report twice. Then he read it a third time. And then he made a phone call to a lawyer and another to a contractor and a third to the pastor of Bethel, a young man named Reverend Dawkins who had taken the pulpit 2 years before and inherited a building he loved and could not afford to keep. That winter, things began to move that Naomi could not see. A foundation she had never heard of paid off the church's outstanding debts, quietly through the denomination, so that it looked like a grant. A structural engineer came one weekday and walked the building and left, and the deacons assumed he was the developer's man and worried. But he was not. Materials were ordered, a crew was put on standby. And Reverend Dawkins, who had been told the whole story under a promise of silence, walked around for 3 months carrying the heaviest and happiest secret of his life, knowing what was coming and unable to say a word, watching Naomi slip into the back of the church each Sunday in her work clothes and slip out again before the last hymn, and having to stop himself every single time from walking back there and taking her hand and telling her that the world had finally noticed. The 6th summer came, the July this story opened on, and Naomi climbed the ladder one more time, not knowing any of it. She found the soft spot near the bell housing and pried up the old patch. The smell of tar rose around her, and she worked through the heat of the afternoon the way she always had. What she did not know was that down in the church office, Reverend Dawkins was on the phone with Walter Banks, and Walter was saying, "It is time," and the Reverend was saying, "Are you sure you do not want to be here?" And Walter was saying, "No, this is not about me. This is about her. You do it. You say it from the pulpit. I will come at the end." So the Reverend hung up the phone and walked out into the sanctuary and looked up at the ceiling, at the water stain that had been there for years and was smaller now because of the woman on the roof above his head. And he made a decision about what he was going to say that Sunday. The Sunday came. It was the 3rd Sunday in July, and the church was fuller than usual because word had gone around the vague way word goes around a small town, that the Reverend had an announcement, and people who had not been to a service in months came to hear it. Naomi almost did not come at all. She nearly skipped it. Tessa wanted to go, though. Tessa was singing with the children that morning, and so Naomi put on the one dress she owned that was not a uniform and sat in the back row where she always sat, near the door, ready to leave early, and she had no idea that every person who knew what was coming had been told to make sure she stayed. Reverend Dawkins stood up after the second hymn. He was nervous. You could see it in his hands. He gripped the edges of the pulpit, and he said he wanted to talk about the building they were sitting in, and a kind of tired sigh went through the older members, because they thought they knew this speech. They thought it was the speech about the developer and the hard decision and the money, and a few of them looked down at their hands. That was not the speech, though. The Reverend said that 90 years ago, people had built this place with their own hands, and that the thing about a building like this was that it did not stay standing on its own. It stayed standing because in every generation, somebody decided it was worth keeping, and usually that somebody did the work when no one could see. And then he said, "I want to tell you about a person in this room who has kept this church standing for 6 years, and who has never once let me thank her, and who is probably getting ready to leave right now, so she does not have to hear this." And Naomi in the back row went very still. The Reverend said her name. He said Naomi, and then he said her last name too, the only time her full name had been spoken aloud in that church in years, and he said that for 6 summers on her one day off this woman had climbed a ladder that was not safe to fix a roof that was not hers, with her own father's tools, with materials she paid for out of money she did not have, and had asked no one for anything and let no one thank her. He said she had stood up to the developer when grown men in the room had gone quiet. He said the water stain over their heads was smaller this year than last because of her. And the whole congregation turned in their seats to look at the woman in the back row. This woman most of them had never really seen, and Naomi sat there with her hands gripping her own knees and her face burning and nowhere to go, because the people she had spent 6 years avoiding were all looking at her at once. She wanted to disappear. The narrator can tell you that plainly because she told her daughter later that she had never in her life wanted so badly to be invisible again. That being seen like that, all at once, felt like standing in a doorway with the wind howling through. The Reverend was not finished, though he said that he had a second thing to tell them and that this was the part he had been carrying for 3 months. And his voice broke a little when he said it. He said that 6 years ago a man had passed through this town when he had nothing and had eaten at the Thursday soup table and had been treated like a human being by people who had no reason to, and that one of those people, on one cold night in the parking lot, had shown him a small kindness that he said had turned his whole life around, and that the man had gone on to build something and had never forgotten this place, and had spent the last year quietly finding out what had become of it. And the Reverend said that the church's debts, the debts that had nearly forced the sale, the debts the developer had been counting on, had been paid in full that winter, all of them, by that man, and that the deacons had not known where the grant came from until that week. The room had gone completely silent. Even the children were still. And then the Reverend looked toward the back doors of the church, and everyone followed his gaze, and Walter Banks stepped in from the vestibule where he had been waiting, a man in his 50s in a plain dark suit, no entourage, no announcement, just a man who had once slept in a car 2 streets over, standing in the doorway of the church that had kept him alive. And he walked down the center aisle, slowly past all the turned faces, and he did not go to the pulpit. He went to the back row, he stopped in front of Naomi, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the whole town watched a thing they did not yet understand. Walter said, "You probably do not remember me." And Naomi looked up at him, at this stranger in the good suit who had come to her, of all people, and something moved across her face, some old memory, surfacing the cold, the flashlight, the flat tire, a tired man's voice saying, "You are the only person in this town who looked at me like I was a person." And she said slowly, "You held the light." And Walter Banks, founder of a company with his name on the building, a man who did not cry in public, put his hand over his mouth and nodded, because she had remembered the one thing about that night that he had remembered too. Not the money he did not have, not the despair, but the light, the small task they had done together in the cold, and the thing she had said to him that he had carried for 15 years. He told her then, in front of everyone, what that night had done. He told them all how he had decided to stop that winter, how he had been at the end of everything, and how a woman in a parking lot fixing a church van had said to him, when he told her he was nobody, "That is because you have decided to be, and you can decide different." He said he had driven out of Cedar Hollow the next morning, and he had decided different, and every hard year after that he had thought of her, and he had promised himself that if he ever had anything at all, he would come back and find out who that woman was. And he had. And he had found out she had spent the years he spent climbing out of his hole, climbing a ladder to keep this same building standing for everybody else. Naomi was crying now, the silent kind. The kind that just runs down a face that is trying to hold still. Tessa had come down from the choir and was standing at her mother's side, holding her mother's hand, looking up at the stranger and at all the faces turned toward them, not understanding yet that her whole life had just changed. Walter said the roof was already taken care of. He said a real crew would be there Monday, that the whole thing would be replaced, the flashing, the decking, the steeple base, all of it, done right, done to last 50 years, and that she would never have to climb that ladder again, unless she wanted to. But he said that was the small part. That was just the building. The thing he had really come to do was harder to say, and he said it looking right at her. He said he had started a foundation, and that the foundation needed someone to run its building program, someone who understood that a building was a promise, a place made to the people inside it, someone who knew how to fix things and how to see the work that needed doing when no one else was looking. He said he did not want to give her money, because he had read enough about her to know she would not take a handout and would be right not to. He wanted to give her a job. A real one, with a real salary, with health insurance for her daughter, with a future in it. He said, "You spent 6 years doing for free the exact thing I need someone to do for a living, and I would be a fool to look any further. Come work for me, let me stop being the man who owes you, and start being the man who hired you." And the church, which had been silent, made a sound then, a kind of collective breath, and somewhere an old woman began to clap, and then they were all clapping, the whole congregation on its feet, and Mr. Pruitt, the old deacon, was weeping openly in the 3rd row because he had stood at the bottom of that ladder for 6 summers, telling her she could not keep doing this alone, and now finally she did not have to. Naomi could not speak. She looked at the man and at her daughter and at the water stain on the ceiling that would be gone by Monday and at the faces of the people she had spent 6 years hiding from, and she understood slowly that the hiding was over, that the thing she had done in private had been seen after all, that the world had been keeping a ledger she did not know about, and the ledger had come due in her favor. She stood up. She did not make a speech. She was not a woman who made speeches. She just said to Walter, to all of them, the only thing she could find, which was, "Thank you." And then she said, "The roof should hold now." And the church laughed and cried at the same time, because it was the truest thing she could have said, the only way she knew to say that something in her own life had finally, after all these years, stopped leaking. Here is the part you came for, the part where you find out whether kindness done quietly in the heat, with nobody watching, comes back around. It does. The narrator can tell you it does. Watch how it settles, though, because the settling is the whole point. Monday, a crew came, 8 men in a truck stacked high with materials, and they tore off the old roof in 2 days and laid a new one in 3. Naomi took the morning off from the hotel to watch, and she stood in the gravel lot in the shade of the maple at the edge of it, and watched men with the right tools and the right safety lines do in a week what she had held together with her own 2 hands for 6 years, and the feeling that came up in her was not what she expected. It was not relief. Exactly, it was closer to the way you feel. Watching a child you raised do well without you. A little ache laced through the gladness. The foreman was an older man with grey in his beard, and at the end of the last day he walked the finished roof with her, pointing out the new flashing around the steeple, and the new decking, and the heavy 50-year shingles laid down tight and true. Then he reached into his coat and handed her something. A flat bar with a worn grip, her father's flat bar, which she had left up there by the bell housing on that last Tuesday and forgotten in everything that came after. He said, "I found this tucked under the old patch by the bell housing. I figured it belonged to somebody who would want it back." And she took it, the worn grip, the tool her father had held for 30 years and she had held for 20, and she turned it over once in her hands and thought about Curtis, about the Sunday his heart gave out, about how he had taught her that a roof was a promise, a building made to the people inside it. She thanked the foreman and put the flat bar in her bag where it belonged. She took the job. Of course, she took the job. She gave her notice at the Garden Court Inn, and the manager, who had never once thanked her for 9 years of clean rooms, looked surprised that she was the kind of person anyone would want to hire, and she did not say anything about that, because she was not a woman who needed the last word. She moved out of the 1-bedroom on Pearl Street that fall into a small house with a yard and a porch and a maple tree that turned the colour of a struck match in October. Tessa got her own room with a window she could draw at, and she taked her house pictures up around the frame the first week. The houses with too many windows, the houses she would build someday. There was no radiator to knock in the night because there was real heat that came up warm and even through the floor vents. And the first winter in that house, Naomi stood at the kitchen sink one night doing dishes and realized she was warm, just warm, and had been warm for weeks without once thinking about it. And she had to put her wet hands flat on the counter for a moment and stand there with her head down because she had spent so many years bracing against the cold that the simple absence of it landed on her like a thing she could feel. She had not known you could grieve the easing of a hardship. She stood at the sink and let it move through her, and then she dried her hands and went to check on her daughter, who was asleep with a light on and a pencil still in her fingers. The foundation work suited her the way she had known it would, though she had never let herself want it. She drove to old buildings in old towns, churches and community centres, and a library with a roof like Bethel's, and she walked them the way her father had taught her, feeling for the soft spot, the place where the water got in, and she made the plans and hired the crews and kept the promises those buildings had made to the people inside them. Water she saw a few times a year. They were not close in the way of people who talk every day, but there was a thing between them that did not need talking, the thing of 2 people who had each, on one cold night 15 years apart, been saved by the same small act in the same parking lot and had spent the years since trying to be worthy of it. The developer never came back to Cedar Hollow. The land under Bethel was not for sale, would not be for sale, because the building had a benefactor now and a building program watching over it and a new roof good for 50 years, and the congregation that had nearly sold it for parking grew a little, the way a thing grows when the people in it stop being afraid of losing it. The water stain on the sanctuary ceiling was painted over that first month, and the plaster underneath was dry and stayed dry through that August storms and every August after. Tessa grew up. She did become an architect, the way she had said she would when she was 9 and drawing houses with too many windows, and at her graduation from the university years later, she gave a short speech as the top student in her class, and she said that she had decided to design buildings because of her mother, who had taught her that a building was a promise, and that the most important work in the world was usually the work nobody paid you for and nobody watched you do. The work you did because it needed doing and because you knew how. And in the audience, Naomi sat in a good dress that was not a uniform, next to an old man in a dark suit who had asked to come, and she did not try to be invisible because she had learned finally that there was no shame in being seen for something you were not ashamed of. I will leave you with this. Some years after all of it, on a Tuesday in July, Naomi drove back to Bethel by herself in the dead heat of the afternoon, the hour nobody comes to a church, and she let herself in and stood in the empty sanctuary and looked up at the ceiling where the stain used to be, and it was clean and dry and whole. She did not climb anything. There was nothing up there that needed her. She had wanted, though, to stand under it once more and feel the thing she had spent 6 summers feeling, which was the quiet satisfaction of a leak stopped, a promise kept, a building still standing because somebody had decided it was worth keeping. And then she took her father's flat bar out of her bag, the one with the worn grip, and she set it on the back pew for a moment in the row where she used to sit so she could leave before anyone saw her. And she looked at it there in the light coming through the high windows, and then she picked it up again and put it away, because the work was not done. It is never done. There is always another building somewhere making a promise. It cannot keep alone, and she knew where the soft spots were, and she knew how to fix them, and she was not hiding anymore. If you have ever done a good thing in private and wondered whether anyone would ever know, I would love to hear about it below. And if this story stayed with you, there is another one waiting, about a man who shoveled his elderly neighbor's walk every winter for 10 years and never knew who was watching from the house across the street, and what that neighbor left him when she was gone.